Grayson could not beat those charges, but we'll see. We'll see how we do.
And of course, as former President Trump after court today, his so-called hush money trial now in the hands of a jury. They'll be back tomorrow after reaching no verdict after several hours deliberating today.
But they did have questions. CBS News' Michael George has the latest from New York.
Former President Donald Trump offered some parting thoughts outside the courtroom after the first day of jury deliberations.
It's a disgrace. This thing ought to be ended immediately. The judge ought to end it.
The 12 Manhattan jurors, 7 men and 5 women, spent about 5 hours deliberating. No cell phones allowed, but they have access to a laptop containing all the evidence.
It's a pretty extraordinary experience because you have people from all walks of life, all kinds of different diverse backgrounds, who are now charged with making this very important decision. They're also, quite frankly, very aware that the world is watching them.
Before beginning deliberations, Judge Juan Merchan gave jurors strict instructions to set aside any opinions and bias in reaching their verdict. He laid out the 34 counts Trump faces and showed the documents related to the payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels, 11 invoices from Trump's ex-lawyer Michael Cohen, 11 checks, 9 of them signed by Trump, and 12 entries in the Trump Organization's ledger. The presumptive Republican presidential nominee is charged with falsifying business records in order to hide an alleged sexual encounter from the voting public just before the 2016 elections. Trump has denied the encounter took place. Before their day ended, the jurors sent a note to the judge asking to hear the judge's jury instructions read back to them, as well as testimony from 2 key witnesses. Specifically, they want to hear what former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker and Michael Cohen said about a Trump Tower meeting in August 2015. Pecker says they came to an agreement with Trump himself about a scheme to kill negative stories about him. The judge indicated those passages will be read back to the jury Thursday. Michael George, CBS News, New York.
If convicted on all counts, the judge could sentence Trump to anything from probation to up to 4 years in prison, though any potential guilty verdict also likely to be appealed.
Veterans